Topics of discussion for today. So, why train to fly IFR? Making the decision to file IFR, planning an IFR flight, conducting an IFR flight, and then we'll end with an open discussion. So, getting a commercially instrument rating is not cheap for civilian pilots, and it's something that many Army aviators take for granted. In this lesson, I hope to show you the life saving and career expanding benefits that come with it being instrument rated, as well as a very basic breakdown of what goes into planning and conducting an instrument flight. By no means is this supposed to be a comprehensive guide to IFR flight, nor is it intended to be a lecture. I encourage you to ask clarifying questions throughout this lesson, but I also request that you hold in depth questions for the open discussion at the end. So, why train to fly IFR? Army pilots were not always trained to fly IFR. Reading Mike Novosels's book, Dust Off, he talks a bit about setting up the instrument flight training program for one of his units back in the 60s. During his time in Vietnam, he was one of only a few aviators in his company that was instrument rated, which allowed him to conduct a daring rescue of a wounded Special Forces soldier one stormy night. For that action, he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, and his instrument training was pivotal in accomplishing that mission. Today, Army regulations state that every flight that can be conducted on an IFR flight plan should be, though in reality, we don't train IFR as often as we should. So why train IFR anyway if we don't use the skills regularly? Let's go over a few things here, some good reasons why. So, one of the biggest differences would be inadvertent meteorological conditions and instrument meteorological conditions, routine operations versus an emergency. Flying in IMC is like swimming. If you're properly prepared for it, you're probably having a nice, relaxing day. If you unexpectedly find yourself in it, you're either fighting for your life or extremely uncomfortable. If you are properly trained on how to fly in instrument meteorological conditions, your odds of survival go up exponentially. Even without proper training, you still run the risk of spatial disorientation if you're flying in and out of the clouds. This is made worse by pilots not wanting to admit the reality of the situation that they're in, that they've gone inadvertent. You're not going to miraculously break out in a few seconds, and every moment wasted puts you in greater danger. You need to commit to IMC as soon as you punch into the clouds, and well-trained instrument pilots have the best chance of success when doing so. So, if you do become an instrument qualified pilot, you need to practice often. At a bare minimum in a 6-month period, you must perform 6 instrument approaches, perform holding procedures and tasks, and perform the task of intercepting and tracking courses through the use of navigational electronic systems. Having the skills to operate by instrument flight rules opens more options to you as a pilot and will set you apart from your peers. If you look at the differences on the screen between the types of VFR and IFR, a competent instrument rated pilot is capable of operating in conditions a VFR pilot would not dare to. In the next section, we'll discuss the decision-making process of when to file IFR and what resources are available to help you make that decision. Regardless of if you're flying or on the ground, the best time to decide to file IFR is before you find yourself in the clouds. An instrument-rated pilot can fly on days VFR pilots are grounded and can even decide to open an IFR flight plan if conditions deteriorate. All of this starts with good pre-mission planning and getting a good weather brief. To guide our lesson today, we will use this scenario to frame the decision-making process that an Army aviator goes through when planning an IFR flight. First, we will discuss the weather, planning resources we use, and some similar tools available to civilian pilots. So, in the grand scheme of maneuver that we're looking at today, we're going to be flying from Austin up to Waco. The VIP movement here, it's a bit of flavor text, but say you're moving about 10 passengers, and during your mission planning process, you see that the weather is going to be deteriorating upon your estimated time of departure from Austin. So, since you have the option to file for IFR, you've decided to leave nothing to chance and to plan for it. Talking a little bit about military weather products, Army aviators rely on 3 main weather products to conduct their mission planning. We start with 5-day forecast well in advance of mission execution, and then check the mission execution forecast the day of the mission. Lastly, the 175-1 weather brief is our specific mission briefing product for IFR flights, though they may sometimes be used for long-distance VFR flights. In the event that METARS, TAFs, or other civilian weather reporting disagrees with our weather products, the SWOs win that argument. We can only use official military products for planning and execution. Before planning a flight, an Army aviator will start by looking at the 5-day forecast and get an idea of what they're expecting for the day of their flight. This allows the decision to be made in advance whether to file VFR or IFR. While the mission execution forecast is primarily used for VFR flights, it's also a useful tool for IFR flights when determining if your plan is feasible for that day. As we saw earlier on the slides, instrument conditions such as low IFR may take those ceilings below what we can even file for IFR. However, you get that in advance by checking the forecast. Checking the forecast also allows you to be aware of forecasted conditions that may affect your plan and allow you to ask your briefer about them when you call for an official brief. You can do this as well as a civilian pilot. Your 175-1 is your official weather briefing from the SWO. Sorry. It can be requested days in advance to be ready in your inbox when you show up for a flight. It is a requirement for all IFR flight plans, but may also be used for VFR cross-country flights to gain better situational awareness. A weather brief is mandatory for all military flights and is valid for 1 hour and 30 minutes after issuance. Unfortunately, civilians are not able to use the same products as military aviators, but there are still many good options for checking the weather before you fly. Aviation Weather Center, FlightOS Flight Services, more commonly known as 1-800-Weather Brief, and FAA Weather Cams are all great options for you. For Flight Weather is also a good option if you decide to pay for it. The Aviation Weather Center offers pre-duty weather briefings from their homepage under the Tools drop-down menu. Regardless if you are planning a VFR or IFR flight, this is an excellent free tool available to you to gain better situational awareness before you even show up for your flight. This allows you to have a better conversation with your weather briefer when you call for that weather brief. So, would you fly in that? Good IFR flight is all about preparation, and most of that is knowing what weather to expect. If you know what weather is going to do, you can plan accordingly and for the worst case scenario. So once again, would you fly on that? Because I did. And it was an excellent flight. That was one of my instrument evaluations when I was in Korea. Next section, I'll break down exactly how we plan for an IFR flight. Checking the weather is the first step of planning any flight. But for VFR flights, it's often as simple as go or no-go criteria, but planning an IFR flight requires taking a much deeper look at the weather. In this section, we'll discuss not only weather planning minimums, but also instrument approach procedure selection and flight route selection. Now that we know a bit about what we use to check the weather, let's take a look at our VIP transport scenario again. I've kept the weather conditions simple for this scenario and presented them in an easy-to-read format. Let's see if we can answer these 3 questions with the 1-3-5 rule on the next slide. Weather planning minimums, or as I like to remember it, the weather worm sends weathergrams. So, 1-3-5. Can I file for the approach? Do I need an alternate? And can I use this as an alternate? For the 1, do I have legal weather to file for the approach I intend to fly? Will I be able to land there? For 3, if I need an alternate, is the weather good enough on arrival? Is the procedure flyable without radar vectors from ATC? And is the NavAid actively monitored for faults or malfunction? Now, this NavAid monitor portion does not necessarily apply to GPS approaches. I'll discuss this a little later, but we monitor that in a different way. If we don't break out on my if I don't break out on my primary approach, is my alternate a safe and reliable approach procedure? So, noting the GPS portion under weathergrams, you can definitely use a GPS approach for your alternate, but only if you haven't used it as your primary approach. We want to build in as much redundancies and backups as we can. Our chart supplements and our instrument approach procedures. So, how do we use our weather planning minimums? And what are we looking at to determine if they are met? The examples on this page are from Draughton Miller's Regional in Central Texas. I remember the sections of an instrument planning procedure with the mnemonic marginal pilots plan profile landings at airports. Notice that the alternate not authorized or ANA in the pilot briefing section correlates to the nav aids being listed as unmonitored on the chart supplement. Though this is not always a direct correlation, in this case, it does. As I mentioned on the previous slide, monitoring does not apply to RNAV approaches. This is because we as pilots monitor RNAV through RAME, RMP, and proper sequencing between RMPs. Now that we've clarified what we're looking for, let's take a look at our intended approaches. Answering the questions of can I file and do I need an alternate? Our VIP and his staff are looking to fly into McGregor Exec in Waco. Currently, the UH-16 Blackhawk is not capable of flying for a LPV or VNAV precision approach, which provides vertical guidance. Instead, we will have to plan for the LNAV non-precision approach, which only gives us an approach course. Our weather minimums for this approach are 401, which is 600 feet below the expected cloud ceilings upon arrival. As mentioned in the planning minimums, we can reduce that visibility by 1/2, and that's unique to helicopter pilots. We cannot, however, reduce visibility by 1/2 on copter approaches. Since the weather is expected to deteriorate below the required 800, 1.5, within the hour of our arrival, we must select an alternate airfield and approach procedure. NavAids will not be directly monitored with regards to monitoring on an RNAV approach. Predictive RAME or RAME Light is how that would be satisfied. So can I use this as an alternate? So this is the VOR DME 32 into Waco. 10 miles away from McGregor Exec is Waco Regional. Though the cloud ceilings are expected to be lower at our time of arrival, they hold steady throughout the hour past our arrival. Though there is an ILS approach at Waco Regional that would get us down to 201, the initial approach fix is 50 miles away and thus too far to practically file for. Though we could expect radar vectors to that, planning for that distance would likely eat into our IFR reserve of 30 minutes. Since the VOR 32 meets all of our criteria for an alternate, we'll plan for this approach as a backup. Going back to our VIP scenario, so now that we've taken a look at our approaches, how do we get from Austin to McGregor Exec? First, we need to check the standard instrument departures leaving Austin and find one that'll set us up for going into CWK. Though it is not strictly required to use a standard instrument departure, you have to annotate on your flight plan that you are specifically not going to use one. So that procedure is generally frowned upon. Standard instrument departures are, as well as standard area, terminal area arrival procedures, help to efficiently funnel traffic in and out of congested airspace, so it's always a good idea to use one. Our first approach into McGregor Exec is GPS, so we'll plan for the Sabre 3, which is an RNAV departure. After that, we'll determine which altitude is appropriate for our direction of travel. I remember this by even in the west, the east is odd, meaning that we choose even altitudes if we're heading west and odd altitudes if we're heading east. The Sabre 3 departure takes us up to 5,000 feet, so we'll plan for that on our initial climb out. However, we will expect 4,000 feet heading west to Barba. then 3,200 to ICI'd per the initial approach procedure. BARBA is our initial approach fix for the RNAV runway 35 into McGregor Executive. This is the standard instrument approach or standard instrument departure we will use out of Austin, the Sabre 3 departure. Though you are not required to use SIDS, you have to specifically state that you're not going to use it, and it's best practice to do so. With the winds out of 340 at 16, we can expect runway 36 to be in use. According to takeoff minimums, we will use modified standard minimums with a climb out of 240 feet per nautical mile till we reach 2,600 feet. At our destination, we'll use the RNAV 35 into McGregor Exec. Note the 2 points we could use as an initial approach fix, ICI'd and BARBA. We'll file for BARBA as it allows us to get lower before arrival on our final approach course. It also allows us to skip the procedure turn published on this initial approach procedure. Another point to note is the minimum sector area on the bottom right-hand corner of the plan view. The minimum sector altitude, on an instrument approach procedure is the lowest altitude that provides at least 1,000 feet of obstacle clearance within a specified sector. Typically a 25 nautical mile radius centered around on a navigation aid or waypoint. For RNAV approaches, such as this one, the MSA is centered on the runway threshold or missed approach point, MAP. So with this instrument departure that we've selected, why would we not choose Centex 8 since that's a more direct route? As we saw on the previous slide, our route of flight is about 90-something nautical miles. However, if we were to file for Centex 8, that would require us to go from CWK Vortac on that radial, direct to ACT Vortac, then backtrack to our initial approach fix and proceed inbound from there. So it may seem like we're flying out of the way instead of flying directly, but due to the routing and the requirements for this departure, it is more reliable to plan for the RNAV departure. Now that doesn't mean that you couldn't request vectors en route, but IFR flight plans must be planned in the event of lost commo, something that we can save for a future date. The DD Form 1801 DoD International Flight Plan is the standard military flight plan. Missed approach procedure to the alternate adds about another 20 minutes of flight time on our flight plan here, leaving an estimated of 53 minutes of endurance remaining, well above the required 30-minute fuel reservoir for the flight. As we filed for here, we're expecting it's going to take us about an hour and 10 minutes to do this, and we have an endurance of 2 hours and 23 minutes that we would have calculated with our performance planning card. And for an IFR flight, it's 90% planning, 10% flying. It's often said that prior proper planning prevents pretty poor performance, and that's doubly true for IFR flight. I like to tell the pilots I mentor to be a diligent planner, so that way you can be a lazy pilot. By that I mean that if you front load the work of mission planning and go into an IFR flight well prepared, you won't even break a sweat.